Hey guys, Mustang here bringing you another Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle video, and so we have the Festival of Battles event going on in the game, an event that I'm sure you're all familiar with and love very much at this point. This is probably, we're going to talk about it in the future, of course, I'm sure for quite a while. I'm still working on actually having my first properly completed run. Make sure you keep an eye out next Saturday when we do the next episode of the Slot 1 Super podcast. We'll be talking all about this event and Saiyan Day, all that good stuff. But this event is pretty terrible. I think it's very, very badly designed. For a couple of different reasons that we won't get into in this video. I think I might do a separate one actually, so keep an eye out for a post that I'll make asking for your guys' feedback on this event, and we'll do a separate video about it. But in the meantime, for those of you in a similar position to me of still battling your way through this, I thought I would make a video going over some of the best units that you can use in this event. Now obviously some of them are going to be pretty straightforward and ones that really don't need any explanation, but there's been some interesting ones that I've seen now from people's actual finished clears, of some units that maybe wouldn't have thought of to use before, or maybe just had not crossed your mind. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and take a look at a few of those. Just a quick one before we get into the main topic of the video here. I want to give a shout out to everyone who has been checking out the channel during the anniversary. We've been having a lot of new people come through the channel, and as you can see from the YouTube analytics, almost half the people watching these videos during the anniversary are not subscribed to the channel. So do go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. We are getting so close to getting to 30,000 subscribers on the channel, which will be an awesome milestone to hit by the end of the anniversary. So if you've been enjoying the content and want all the future Dokkan content, not going to stop covering this game anytime soon, then do subscribe to the channel and enjoy the rest of the video. Okay, so we're going to start off with the very obvious, right, which is of course the 10th anniversary tech Vegeta and Goku, aka the Vegito, and I guess we might as well straight away mention the AGL Gogeta. Most of the completed clears that I've seen that have been legit, because obviously there was a bunch of modded ones on day one, to the point where the JP actually made a post about it. The fact that there's been a bunch of I think it's probably just a weird translation of the word, but illegal clears of the thing that they're going to take off of the leaderboard. But yeah, there's the legit clears that I've seen have pretty much all been using either double Vegeta or double Goku, because obviously you get the full 220 lead. These guys are ridiculously powerful units. They're on each other's leader skill, so you obviously get to use both of them if you have both of them. And then the big thing is you want to be stacking up with these guys, and then when you get to the end, you kind of have to go all out in the final two phases against Vegito and Gogeta, and that's where you're going to want to be using your fusions, using the abilities like the Vegito taunt, especially for the very final phase, phase 50 against Tech Vegito. He can super 3 times, and his super attack does is it 24 million. So realistically, the only thing that will get you through that turn is characters that have either stacked up to at least 12 million plus and have guard or some kind of damage reduction, or obviously that's when you want to really get that Vegito turn, because Vegito has guard, 60% damage reduction, and then obviously the taunt gives him that massive defense boost for the turn. So if you've been stacking enough, he's going to have ridiculously high defense on that turn as it is anyway. The problem when it comes to these two units that you guys have to think about is how long should you stack these units for? And that is the big thing that I've heard a lot of people ask, because I did a run that we tried to finish on stream the other day, and we ended up losing in the Namek Goku and Glorio phase because we couldn't do enough damage to kill them. And a lot of people were saying in the chat and in the comments afterwards that I had stacked defense on these guys for too long, and they weren't able to do enough damage, because these guys, remember, when you switch them into their more defensive state, which you potentially will have to use nearer to the end, depending on what the rotations are looking like, depending on where you put them in the rotation, you have to remember that they have these abilities. Like Goku has guard if he's in slot 1. He has a great chance to dodge, which is 70%. But even if he doesn't dodge, if you stack him up to, let's say, 3 million defense, because he has guard, he will still tank a super that does between 5 to 6 million, And of course, he has the 60% chance, 70% chance to dodge it anyway. Now, slightly better defensively when it comes to having stacked up a decent amount of defense is the Vegeta. It's funny because in shorter events, like when you first switch them into these defensive modes, Goku is arguably better on the first turn because of that dodge, potentially coming in clutch. But this Vegeta has 50% damage reduction. Then he has 20% damage reduction when receiving an attack if you got 10 or more ki, which at that point, because it's very easy to build up ki with these guys, you're probably going to have 10 or more ki when he gets hit. Literally every time he gets hit. So he has 70% damage reduction. And the thing is, he has guard in slot 1, but realistically, once you've stacked him up to like, 3 million defense, in slot 2 or 3, even though he doesn't have guard, he still has 70% damage reduction. And as we start to get to the later phases before we get to Vegito and Gogeta, you're getting up to some of these characters like Dragon Fist Goku, Fat Buu, Beast Gohan. They're hitting for around 6 to 7 million supers once you get to that point. But if we take 7 million and then we minus 70%, that's 2.1 million. So if Vegeta has 3 million defense at that point, you're all good. Now, obviously, when we get to Glorio and Daima Goku, they're hitting for about 17 million, which is, quite frankly, pretty ridiculous. But when you take 70% of that away, that leaves 5.1 million. So the thing is, to really be truly safe, this guy would need to have like 5 million defense. But the thing you have to remember is the other character abilities that you can have floating around on the team. By the time you get to the Daima Goku and Glorio, ideally you have units on the team that have a scouter ability available. And of course, as we've done on stream, something that we've talked about in the past, that's something that I very much don't like to do when it comes to challenge runs, but this event has definitely broken me at that point, is you can use the thing where you fuse with, like this guy, for example. You could switch back to Goku, fuse into Vegito. That gives you a scouter so you see where the super attack is on the turn. Then you reset the app so that it goes back to the start of the turn, and then you just don't fuse, and the super attack is in the same place. And when it comes to fighting those bosses, they don't hit hard enough with their normals to be able to do damage to this guy. Because in fact, if we look at the list of the enemies, I know this isn't the zoomed in version, but we can scroll down. Like once we get to where this is where they start to really hit hard. Phase 40 is World Tournament Goku. He supers for 1.8, which is nothing. If you've stacked your units up to 2 million defense, even without guard or damage reduction, they just eat that for breakfast, right? But then you get to phase 41, full power Goku hits for 3.3, then Vegito's 3.9, Dragon Fist 4.4, Beast is 6.3, Buu is 5.6. But remember, their normals are doing 2 million at most when you get to Kid Buu. 3.3 for UI Goku. So again, with this Vegeta with the 70% damage reduction, if you're using the like scouter hack, he's gonna tank normals, right? It's only against these guys when we start to get into like 11.5 million from Tech UI, 12.9 from the One Punch Goku, and then these guys 17.5. If you don't have a unit with a permanent scouter on the rotation, then yeah, you can just use the fusion app reset scouter trick, and then these guys in their defensive forms are going to be able to tank those normal attacks if they've built up enough defense. Because yeah, the Daima Goku and Glorio, their normals do 5 million. So if a unit has guard, you're only looking at 2.5 to 3 million ish. So if you've stacked up these guys to 3 million defense, roughly thereabouts, then they should be fine. Because especially on rotations where you potentially have some support, that number goes up a little bit. Or if you're using like Super Saiyan 4 Goku and he supered on the previous turn, those numbers go up a little bit. So I would say you want to get these guys to about 3 million defense. And then from then on, as long as they're not eating a super, which you have ways to get around that later in the event, they should be fine. Now, we mentioned this Goku, the Super Saiyan 3 to Super Saiyan 4. This guy is definitely an MVP. He is a super, super good unit to have on this team for multiple reasons. The main thing is that once you transform into Super Saiyan 4, he infinitely stacks on both of his super attacks. And then, of course, he's giving Power Beyond Super Saiyan and Giant 8 Power allies support. Now, a lot of the characters that you're going to run on this team aren't necessarily on those categories, but some of them are. And then, of course, as we already mentioned, he does the 44% buff for 2 turns with his 18 key super, which is hugely beneficial for the next rotation. And if you get this guy out early enough and start stacking with him, then he can end up getting to a really high level of defense, to the point where, because he also has guard and then he has 10% damage reduction because he's giving that support to himself as well, you can get to some turns later on where, especially if you know, like if you do have a scouter active, he can go in slot 1, and therefore he's giving that 44% buff to the whole of the rotation as well as the next rotation. Because remember, the tricky thing about the later phases isn't just the amount of damage that these guys do, it's the fact that you have to be able to kill them in the 2 or 3 turns, especially once we get to this guy right here, phase 41. This is when you first get to have 3 turns, and you can see from the previous boss we go from him having 140 million HP to 400 million HP. And then when you get to these guys, this is why these guys are kind of a run killer for a lot of people, Namek Goku and Glorio. The phase before, the One Punch Goku, he has 900 million, and funnily enough, the phase before him, UI is only 4.5 or 4.5, 450 million, I should say. So that doubles for this guy. But then these guys have 800 million each. So that's 1.6 million or 1.6 billion damage worth of HP you have to do in 3 turns. So this is where, like, this is the furthest I've gotten. And then the 3rd turn ended with one of these guys still alive with about 1/3 of their HP. So you've got to maximize your damage output at all times, which is why having units like this guy on the team and then transformed are obviously very, very useful. So this guy is an absolute MVP, and I would say the trick that I've now found from having these couple of attempts, like getting caught in the early phases, one of the things that I definitely recommend that you do is, obviously I'm sure at this point you guys understand how rotations work, and when you get your starting turns, you know how to get like a unit that you want on a specific turn. So you want to get this Goku onto turn 5. So if he's on turn 1, just keep him on rotation, because then he'll be on turn 3, and then he'll be on turn 5. If he's on turn 2, float him off straight away in slot 3, and then he'll be back on turn 5. If he was in slot 7 and he starts on turn 3, keep him on rotation, and then he'll be on turn 5. For those of you who weren't 100% sure, that's how you make sure you get him on turn 5, because then he can transform. And phase 5 is against Int Sword of Hope Trunks, and he doesn't have a lot of HP. So this Int Sword of Hope Trunks that is in phase 5, I'll see how much he has exactly. So these guys have 30 mil. He has 30 mil. I guess they all have like the same amount until you get to these guys, but it's because there's 2 of them. If you transform on turn 5 against this Trunks, I've had it where I've even missed a super with one of the 3 attacks with the Giant Ape, and the Giant Ape should kill this Trunks, and my Goku's only 55%. So if you have dupes in your Goku, he's definitely killing this Trunks. And then that means you have Super Saiyan 4 Goku out from phase 6 onwards, and then you can start with all this stacking from his super attack effect. And then yeah, he will be very, very good, be able to do lots of damage because he gets like his very good crit chance. And then yeah, he's buffing everybody else, which makes it a little bit safer for the early turns, as well as like allowing people to do extra damage, which is very, very helpful as well. So this guy is an absolute MVP. Get him on the right rotation, transform him on turn 5, and then off you go. Now, the next big ones that are very obvious, of course, are the 7-year LRs. I feel like we don't need to talk about these guys too much, right? They are 2 of the best units in the game. I feel like everybody knows what they do at this point. They are greatly stacking attack and defense on both of their super attacks. So the more super attacks you get, the better. The hardest part about the event is the fact that because you're running a team of mostly stackers, I say the hardest part, right? There's like 50 million factors that make this event really hard, but is managing who is getting to attack. Because in the early phases, the bosses die fairly quickly, so not everybody on the rotation is going to get to attack. So you kind of have to make sure early on that you're swapping these characters around a little bit and letting them kind of almost like take it in turns, right, as who is actually going to be able to get some stacks. Because you still want to make sure you're actually killing the boss, because even in the early phases, one thing you don't want to do, depending on the rotation that you end up with, you don't want to make the mistake of having both the 10 years, like the Goku and the Vegeta here. You don't want to have them both in their defensive stages because you're trying to stack, but then they don't do a lot of damage, and then whoever the unit is in slot 3 then doesn't actually kill the boss, and so you lose, because in the early phases you only get 1 turn. That is something that you have to be very much aware of. But these guys obviously can do a lot of damage. You want to try and make sure that as much as possible you're getting 20 ki with them, because it gives them effective against all types, and then at that point 2 guaranteed additional super attacks. because that's one thing that can be a killer as well. If you don't get them the effective against all types and you're fighting a boss where they have type disadvantage, it doesn't matter if they do 3 super attacks. If they don't crit, they're not doing a lot of damage and you can end up losing the run. And then the big thing with these guys is, when do you fuse? So I usually try and get at least all the way up to phase 41, which is the full power Super Saiyan 4 Goku, before I consider fusing with these guys. Because Gogeta has the ability to have damage reduction. He has the ability to counter an enemy super attack. So obviously RNG can go against you, but realistically you want him to be transformed with, I would say, around 10 million defense, because then even some of the hardest hitting bosses, like when we get to the end and we're up against Vegeta and Gogeta, they're super attacking for 24 million, but with guard and then the damage reduction that he can pick up with orbs, and then once you have transformed him, if you get him on rotation with the Super Saiyan 4 Goku, who's then giving him extra defense and extra damage reduction, even if he doesn't counter their super, he will still survive it if his defense gets up to that level. So I try and stack the Super Saiyan 4s up to around 9 to 10 million before I then transform them into Gogeta. Now with the gods, it's a little bit more difficult, because obviously once they transform, they don't have damage reduction, they have dodge chance. And so of course you're relying on the RNG that they are actually going to dodge. Otherwise, when it comes to these big super attacks, like, they will take a lot of damage, right? Now, of course, both these units, when they're transformed, they do have the action break on their 18 key super, which unfortunately for Gogeta can be counterproductive, because often if the enemy's doing a super attack as the first attack after he attacks, that's the slot you want to put him in, because he's the one on the rotation that can counter a super, but then he just breaks their super away with his super attack, which is really annoying, because in these later phases where the bosses have tons of HP, a super counter helps towards killing them before the turns run out, because it does so much damage. So sometimes that can be an awkward juggle. Like, honestly, sometimes it does feel like you can get thrown into situations where you get to a certain turn, and if you are on literally the final turn out of the 3, and it's just like, oh yeah, I just can't win now, and I'm like 44 phases deep. Like, so this event, I get, is very frustrating. You want to try and use these strategies to maximize your run in this event, right? Because once this guy's transformed, especially once you've stacked up to the point where he's at 10 million defense, once he becomes the Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta, his super attacks are doing like 120 million attack stats and stuff like that. So he obviously dishes out a ton of damage. You don't need to worry as much about getting certain amounts of ki, but remember that the rainbow orbs not only give him crit chance as well as damage reduction, but he also gets an extra 50% attack when you get to 24 ki. So ideally you do want to be hitting 24 ki with him as much as possible to do that extra damage. And then the gods, obviously they are, whilst they're not as good defensively, can get so many attacks. With 20 ki they get a guaranteed additional, but they also get a guaranteed additional super with 7 orbs, because sometimes it can be so easy to get ki with them. You can get 24 ki without picking up 7 orbs, but you still want to try and get 7 orbs if you can, because then you have the extra attacks, and these guys can do a ton of damage as well. So obviously these guys are go-to picks. I don't know if I've seen any clears where people didn't have these guys on the team, but I'd have to double check. But then we have a guy who's made a bit of a comeback. I made a short about this yesterday, the Int Namek Goku. Int Namek Goku is actually really, really good in this event as well. He is a unit that early on, when the bosses aren't hitting very hard, you can let him take the hit that he needs in slot 1 in order to get the guaranteed extra attack. Then on the next turn you can put him in slot 3 or slot 2, depending on who you want to stack up that turn, and he still has the buff from getting hit on his previous appearance, so he gets the guaranteed additional from that. And then obviously by being in slot 2 or 3 he gets another additional super attack. So this guy can actually stack up really, really fast. It's interesting to see just how quickly he does stack. People had sort of fallen out of favor, or at least were very underwhelmed with his EZA, because some of the anniversary difficult content was hitting too hard too early for him to be able to survive. But because, as we've seen from here, like, bosses don't super for more than 2 million until you get to all the way down to like stage 41. So this guy is able to survive, especially in slot 1. He has 30% damage reduction. After 1 turn, he's able to tank all of these bosses' normal attacks in slot 1. So it's very, very easy to get him fully built up, right? And in the early phases, obviously, again, as we said, the bosses don't have a ton of HP, but in these first few phases, like, bosses are not hitting very hard, especially with their normals. Like, he can very easily go in slot 1 and get off a decent amount of stacks. So he is actually very, very good for this event. Obviously, there's not many points throughout this where you fight an extreme enemy, but when there is, he does a little bit of extra damage and gets the extra built-in crit chance, but that's kind of neither here nor there. He has the active skill, which I guess you can use. You can only use it against an extreme class enemy who's already on low HP, so I guess when is the last time this is even viable to use? Who's the last extreme enemy you fight? This Boo. So I guess if you get onto this Boo and you get the right turn where Namek Goku's on rotation and and this Boo's at 30% or less HP, you can do the active skill for some extra free damage. Otherwise, you got to throw it out against who? Like Cooler, maybe Cell. But basically, once you get to Cell, if you can use Goku's active skill either against Cell, Cooler, or Boo, I'd probably just go ahead and use it. Otherwise, you're potentially going to get to a point where you don't actually get to use it at all. But yeah, Namek Goku is definitely very, very good for this event. And now we have some that are not as obvious and not as common choices, but ones that I have seen people use in successful runs, and some that are somewhat hypothetical. So we'll have to see how these go. I would love to see a run. There's one unit in particular I would love to see somebody do a run with, although this is the kind of event where I'm sure most people, once you beat it, you probably never want to look at it again, let alone jump back in and start testing out other units. But someone who we know is an MVP that I used on my first run, when I first attempted it when it came out on stream, was the Tech Gohan. Because, of course, this guy is a beast. He can build up super quickly, especially if you're getting those multiple super turns. He has guard, so he's just a safe option. He doesn't do a lot of damage unless he gets hit first, which can be an issue later on when you're really trying to kill the bosses as quickly as possible. But because he has guard, once you've stacked up to a decent amount of defense, then obviously you can just transform him into the ultimate Gohan. And then, of course, not only is he still going to have that ridiculously high defense, he only has to get hit once, and then he has the permanent attack buff, and he can be hitting incredibly hard. So this Gohan is really, really good. Definitely a solid unit to throw on the team. The only thing with this guy is I never understand, like, how they differentiate some of these characters. I guess I think the main thing is the character was supposed to have won for them to be on the category, but he's not on Earth Protecting Heroes, which means he's not on the leader skill for the Vegeta or Gogeta. When I tried my first run, I was running double Glorio leads, and this guy was definitely very, very helpful. Now, Glorio is another one of these units. He leads Demonic Power for 200%, but then he leads Battle of Wits or Accelerated Battle for 170, and so that team includes the 10 years, Super Saiyan 3 to Super Saiyan 4 Goku. It includes the LR Super Saiyan 4s, because these guys are on Accelerated Battle. For some reason, these guys are on there and these guys aren't, which is kind of annoying, which means they're not on Glorio's team, but these guys are, and obviously they are very useful. I would argue in this fight especially, like, Gogeta is just so much more useful than the gods because of the Scouter and the super attack counter. But yeah, this guy's really good. The only problem with this guy is that when you get to the later phases, and this was the stress I was having on stream, is when the bosses start to be hitting for like 10 million plus, even with the amount of defense this guy can build up to, because he does stack permanently, and then after he's done a bunch of supers, his defense goes up an insane amount. But once you get to the point where the bosses are hitting for like 10 million, then obviously at that point, if he isn't like dodging that super, then you die. And it gets very tense when you're like every single turn, after you've already been playing the event for like 2.5 hours, every single turn that Glorio is on is a situation of like, well, he better dodge in slot 3, otherwise I die. And he's been pretty good. He's been pretty consistent in the runs that I had. I didn't actually have the run that I lost end with him getting killed, but the other downside, I guess, to him is that he can do decent damage, but not as much as some of these other crazy units. But of course, he's providing a lot of support to the team, so he is making the other units on the team hit a bit harder as well. So he definitely is very, very good, and definitely a unit worth considering. But realistically, with the categories he's on being so few, if you are using him, you're probably just using him as the leader. And whilst that team build can potentially work, I've seen a lot of people saying that you basically need double Vegito, because obviously Vegito is so ridiculously good, or double Gogeta just because of how crazy they are once they fuse. People have done it with double Gogeta leads, because obviously double Vegito gives you 2 Vegitos. That gives you 2 of the turns where you get his active skill with the target ability, which I think is probably the more easy way to do it, but still going to be pretty tough. But Glorio definitely can be very good. Then we have this guy. I've seen a few people using this guy. Tech Vegeta, obviously he can stack up to pretty crazy levels of defense if you get him going nice and early. There are a few different phases where you fight Goku. We've obviously got characters on our team whose names include Goku, so you can get some decent super attacks early on. The problem with this guy and some of the other characters that we could look at, similar to Glorio, I guess, in a way, is that he doesn't really do a lot of damage. So, because like when he's in his base form, he can still build up to reasonable numbers, but he's not going to be doing insane amounts of damage, and that could potentially hurt you in the later phases until you do finally decide to transform. And then obviously once you do transform, he can hit relatively hard. He's still got the guard. He's got 18% damage reduction, which is obviously not a lot, but when you're rocking like really high levels of defense, that's still going to help. And in those later stages, kind of like we said with the some of these other characters, like the defensive versions of the 10 years, is you can use these either tricks, if you want to call it that, with the reset, or obviously characters like Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta. As long as you have a scouter or the ability to activate a scouter, you know where the super's going to be. This Vegeta can provide a decent amount of extra damage support while being able to tank all normals, and it's only really the super attacks that you have to worry about making sure he doesn't get hit by, right? And then funnily enough, this next character, it's kind of crazy. I saw Minato made a tweet saying that Omatsu was playing 8D chess with this guy because his release was just considered such a massive fumble. But I've seen people beat the event with this AGL Namek Scouter Vegeta. Because obviously he's another infinite defensive stacker. He also stacks attack, and it's a greatly raised, so obviously he can end up hitting relatively hard. He does have damage reduction and dodge chance. He's also an orb changer who creates rainbow orbs, which does help out with like the 7 years getting their 20 key, making sure like the 10 years are getting their 18 key early on so they get their stacks. Like he can be very useful on the team. I'm almost like, it pains me to give this guy any kind of credit because I think this guy's awful. Like after his release and as we went through the later part of last year, like I wasn't even putting this guy in my top 10 of like TURs. I thought he was absolutely terrible. But he's on the 200% lead for the double Gogeta setup because obviously basically all Vegetas are on that setup, like all Gokus are on the Vegito one. And strangely enough, he can be very good in this event. He also has the active skill, which you can use to do big damage on one particular turn, and then it gives him a permanent 50% attack buff for the rest of the fight. So it's one of those things, you could save it till near the end for like a big damage active skill turn, or you want to use it early so he's just then doing more damage from then onwards. I think the best bet is probably you save it till you get to one of those points where you are actually concerned that you might not finish off that boss in the 3 turns, and then you just go ahead and bust out his active skill to do that little bit of extra damage. But yeah, this guy can actually stack up well enough to be used, which is honestly crazy to me, but it is what it is. But obviously he's most effective if you use the double Gogeta leads, because if you're using double Vegito, he's only going to get the 170 from the Pure Saiyan part of their leader skill, and then obviously he's not going to be as effective. But if you're missing any of these other units we mentioned, then of course you could use him. And then last but not least, I really wanted to give a shout out to this guy. I want someone out there to be crazy enough to try a run with this guy on the team, and that is the Int Broly, because loads of people didn't like his Easy A when it happened during the worldwide celebration, but he's infinitely stacking defense as well as a greatly raised for the stacking attack. He's got damage reduction, and then obviously if there's a Pure Saiyan, Hybrid Saiyan or Movie Heroes enemy, he gets an extra attack that has a great chance to become a super, and extra damage reduction and crit chance after he's attacked. So many of the enemies in this run are Pure Saiyans, Hybrid Saiyans or Movie Heroes, so if you get enough attacks like early on, he can get some decent stacks. A lot of the enemies later on are Gokus, so he gets another additional super and more damage reduction and crit chance. So this guy could actually be quite useful. The only problem I would say with using him really is the fact that none of these teams that we're kind of talking about in terms of like who are the better leaders and who's the best setups to use in terms of like the actual leader of the team, he's not going to be on any of those leader skills higher than 170, right? Because he's a pure Saiyan, so he'll be on the 170 leads for both of the 10 years. And then realistically, they're the two main leaders you want to be using, other than maybe Glorio, and then he's not on Glorio's leader skill either. Is he? He's not on Accelerated Battle, is he? He is not. So yeah, I would love to see a run of someone using the Int Broly. So let me know if you have tried him out in the event. I just think he could be quite good here. Maybe, I guess, if I fail the current run that I'm on, maybe I'll try a run with this guy on there. But I think he could be quite interesting. So let me know what you guys think of the new event. What is your team build, especially if you have successfully beaten the event? What was your team build and who were the units that you considered the MVPs? Give us your strats on how much you stacked up defense, when you transformed. Like I say, as a brief summary, I would say you want to stack both of these guys up to somewhere around 3 million defense, maybe 3.5 if you want a little bit of extra. And then from that point onwards, you want to be going all out damage to make sure that you're building up enough attack to be doing damage later on. You do have to be very careful though, again, using things like the scouter trick and stuff like that, because I've lost a run. I know he killed a lot of people in their initial runs, but I lost a run earlier against Int Fatboo because I had this guy in slot 3, which means he doesn't get he gets 20% damage reduction, but that's it. And he's got type disadvantage against that Boo. And that Fat Boo hits for 5.6 million. So with type disadvantage, it's actually closer to like over 8 million. And so 20% damage reduction is not enough for a unit with 3 million defense to take tank an 8 million damage super. So you got to be very careful. And then yeah, these guys I would say transform them as late as possible. When you get to a point where you really need the extra damage, transform them. And then these guys I would say try and stack up to about 10 million defense before transforming into Gogeta. But yeah, let me know how you guys got on down below. What have your team builds been looking like? What are your overall thoughts on the event? Let me know all of that stuff down below in the comment section. So that is going to be it for the video, guys. This has been the Master Ningen. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Check out the links down below, and I will see you all again soon. Have a good one.